Hello, everyone. Welcome to this seminar on Black Sea stories. Thank you for joining us during your lunch hour or whatever time it is, wherever you are. We're thrilled to have you here. My name is Kelly O'Neill, and if you don't know me, I'm a historian and director of the Imperia Project here at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. And I am both introducing one of our panelists and serving as a panelist as well. So forgive me for doing double duty. But it is a real pleasure and honor to welcome here in the Zoom room and here in Cambridge, a wonderful colleague. Boris Belge is here with us today. He's a visiting scholar at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he is also a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Basel, where he spends most of his time. He's funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, and he is currently working on his second book project, which is entitled Managing Trade. He is investigating infrastructure and economic practices in the port of Odessa for roughly a little over a century, the long kind of 19th century, from 1794 to 1905. He is also the author of an incredible piece of work on the history of sound and Soviet modernity, and he's a really wide-ranging and engaging scholar. So he and I are thrilled to welcome you here to have really a conversation about the Black Sea. And both of us have been reminded, for obvious reasons, over the last few months of the importance of the Black Sea, its multivalent importances. We approach it as from the perspective of historians, and primarily historians who work on the 18th and 19th century. But we are very much aware that the places that we are going to be describing, from Odessa all the way over to the Sea of Azov and Mariupol, are places that have new resonance in the minds of all of you who are gathered here today. And so we're both interested in and acutely aware of the connections that either seem to be in place or kind of invite exploration between past and present. So we are going to have two presentations, and we are going to do our best to stay within our time limits and each talk for just about half an hour. And we have sworn to each other that if we go over, we will knock on each other's door and kind of bang each other on the head and tell each other to stop talking, so that we do have time for question and answer at the end of the session. So best intentions on that. Boris will give the first talk, and I had promised to give his paper title and then forgot to write it down. So I'm going to ask him to tell you the final version of the paper and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Before that, I want to express my sincere gratitude for having me here. It's really a pleasure and honor to talk with you about the moving of grain in Odessa, which has kept my mind busy over the past months. And I'm really excited about having the opportunity to present some part of my project here. So I will share the screen immediately, and then we can... So that is all good, right? So my talk today will be about a special place in Odessa. And this special place is the warehouse. And I'm going to investigate the special order of storage and transportation in the port of Odessa in the long 19th century. Why do I want to do that? That is because there is a story that is often told about Odessa. And it is a kind of a Black Sea story that is often told. And the story always goes on like this, that the opening of new global trade routes harmed Odessa, most important, the opening of the Suez Canal, and thereby diminishing the role of the Black Sea in global trade. The second part of the story is that the decline of Odessa already began in the 1850s and 1860s. So there's a good part of the 19th century in Odessa. That is the first part, and then there's a bad part. That is the second half of the 19th century. And the reason for that decline is the Crimean War, which interrupted the boom Odessa experienced in the 1830s and 40s. is the end of the Porto Franco regime of free trade and the rise of emerging competitors in both Americas. And then the story goes on to tell that Odessa basically was a victim of A, bad fate, and B, a lack of favor from Petersburg ministries. So the story then tells that Nikolaev outweighed Odessa among Petersburg bureaucracies. And that's a random sources compiled at the bottom that tend to follow this story. So there is a book publication, there is an archival source, and there is a report from the 1890s getting into the story. And while some of this story holds true, I want to draw your attention to one thing that might give a little different perspective, and that is talking about warehouses. And I will elaborate on what this different perspective is in the end of my talk. So let me get you to the port of Odessa in the 1890s, and you might just imagine, zooming in by looking at this picture standing across the sail ships. And then you would follow me to meet Alexander Grin, a famous Russian writer who came to Odessa in 1896 and who tried to make a living there under difficult circumstances, and then became a famous writer of fictitious novels. But what stood out is that in his 40s, he wrote a two-page story, which is called Incidental Income, Случайный доход. This was published in 1924. And their autobiographic elements cannot be concealed. So I guess it's even more interesting. And this remarkable reading sheds light on unexposed areas of Odessa's port history, its warehouses. So the story's hero is a young man trying desperately to get hired by a captain as part of a ship crew. Soon, all he could do was, quote, click his teeth when walking past bakeries. Sometimes at night, the compassionate hand of a watchman would hand me a whole loaf of bread from some ship, but that was only enough for a day. After a last, ultimate humiliation, the protagonist offers a wealthy merchant to get one of his fingers cut by a passing railroad just to enjoy the suffering. The hero discovers a way to make money. And I quote, while walking through Quarantine Harbor, the hero meets a fellow who immediately sets him up as a marker. And here, Grin describes the duties of a marker as such. Quote, on every luggage, crate, or sack, there is a mark or letter, A5 or SK, for example. Thanks to these marks, shipments from different shippers are not mixed up in one pile because the marker stands at the door of the warehouse, that is the pagaus, and directs each porter to the corner where the goods that correspond with the mark of the next load are already stacked. For the hero, this task seems doable, and he takes the job, earning 1 ruble a day. The proximity to luxurious goods, however, is too much for Grin's protagonist. He can't resist the temptations of, quote, boxes of oranges, lemons, pomegranates, sacks of nuts, pistachios, quote end, and uses his penknife to cut the sacks open and fills it into his pockets. This doesn't go unnoticed. And one day, a customs soldier happened to come up from behind me, only to gasp. I had made too big a hole. However, when he looked back, he followed my example, filled his pockets with nuts, and then very skillfully and firmly sewed up the hole. So this short story points to 3 crucial aspects of Odessa's port storage infrastructure that I will develop a little bit further in this talk. Firstly, a port is not always about moving and expediting goods in global trade routes. Sometimes it becomes necessary or even desirable to stall movement and to store goods in a particular place. Telling stories of storage questions paradigms of accelerated movements and of globalization of goods during periods of intense globalization. Secondly, warehouses were spaces in between. As such, they stored goods that were already brought to Russian soil, but not imported or shipped yet. In fact, this was the reason why they were so closely watched by customs soldiers. A closer look at these buildings unravels spatial orders of trade in a major global port and Odessa's place in the global trade network of the 19th century. And thirdly, port construction involved not only bureaucrats in the ministries and local administrations, architects and engineers, but also merchants and entrepreneurs who had a vital interest in the port's well-functioning. So what I want to do in that talk is that I will first speak briefly about what warehouses were all about. So I will explore how the system worked and why it was needed. Then I will elaborate a bit on how that system changed in the middle of 19th century with globalization, globalization and global capitalization kicking in. And then I will elaborate a bit on how grain transportation to and from the storehouses increasingly became a matter in the imperial and global arena in the 1870s. And if I have the time, I will just then briefly conclude by depicting the scattering of Odessa storage system across and beyond the city in the 80s and 90s. So please let me get to my first part. So how did warehouses work? What were they needed for? I really like this lithography. It's a lithography painted in the 1850s in Munich. And I'm not sure if you can see it. There are many numbers, just, numbering all the important buildings. One building, however, isn't numbered. And that is this very gray ochre boring building you can see here on the left. But it's a very important building because this is the customs warehouse. And I want just draw your attention to the buildings on the right. These are storehouses in Perisip, of which I will talk later. So, but now we will concentrate on the ochre gray building on the left, the customs warehouses. So storehouses in Odessa were mainly needed for three different functions. The first was customs regulations, the control of the state of what goes in and out the port. The second was pandemic prevention. And the third was a buffer for shipments. And all three aspects guaranteed the functioning of the port. In Russia, as elsewhere, customs warehouses were premises where goods for which customs duty had not yet been paid were stored under special supervision. The idea was that these warehouses delayed the merchant's decision to import goods upon arrival in the port or to ship them. The owner could deposit the duty fee and be allowed to store the goods in the warehouses. If they were shipped to another port, he would get the fee back. And you might now wonder why I'm talking about goods coming into the port when I then plan to develop more on grain leaving the port. But it is essential to understand that a majority of the grain coming to Odessa basically was coming on ships via the so-called cabotage network, that is shipment from other Russian ports on the northern shore of the Black Sea. So there is grain coming into the port to then get loaded onto ships, bringing them into the world. Odessa always lacked storage room and could not provide sufficient space to cope with the ever-increasing volume of goods shipped to and from Odessa. The small building you can see here was too small to store all items, and the customs authorities had to rely on the merchants' capabilities of piling goods. They rented buildings of private merchants or granted them the right to store goods on their own, as long as these goods bore an unbroken customs seal. In doing so, they were treated as if they were in a customs warehouse, and I will talk a bit about that later. This leap of faith for the traders was not always rewarded, and unsurprisingly, smuggling and theft was more the rule rather than the exception, as Green's story so vividly describes. In a wider sense, storage rooms and magazines for customs in Odessa were not the only necessities for running a free port. Storehouses fulfilled two more functions, as I already mentioned: quarantine and buffering. The port's authorities built structures to facilitate the implementation of quarantine regimes. Some goods needed, for example, to be fumigated, that is wool and linen, to get rid of microbes traveling around. And the third function was that there was always the unpredictability of shipping, especially in the sailing era. Merchants could not always rely on fixed dates for the arrival and departure of ships, so they had to cope with volatile amounts of goods brought to the port and ready for shipping. This pragmatic use of storage space was then joined by a fourth capitalist exploitation of space in the middle of the 19th century. When the telegraph arrived at Odessa and merchants made extensive use of the possibility of speculation, it became increasingly desirable to determine the date of a transaction and to delay the sale of commodities. Subsequently, warehousing became a facet of the circulation of capital. And I'm going to tell one of these stories now. And this story is about a special warehouse, the Paputo Warehouse, where merchants compete over and make money from renting these storehouses. The story I want to tell you is a bit complex and complicated. It is embedded in economic and political contexts, And there are lots of names and persons involved in it. But I just want to ask you, stay with me. I'm going to give as much orientation as possible. You can see the dramatis personae right here. And yeah, let's dive into it. After Odessa's initial boom in the 1830s, hunger for storage room in Odessa grew. The original premises for the storage of goods soon reached their limit, as I already mentioned. One temporary solution the city Duma found was to get the merchants involved. The Duma expected merchants as real estate owners to contribute to the port's customs and quarantine regime. In some cases, they were allowed or even expected to make use of their buildings for storage, and the customs seal substituted the physical presence of goods in the customs warehouse. As a result, this created an opportunity for Odessa's merchants to make additional profit. In 1841, the premises of the Odessa customs were in a bad state, and the construction committee of Odessa reported severe damages to the storerooms. New space had to be found. Since the damaged parts had to be repaired, the city Duma started to look for new storerooms and appointed a special commission for this task. The port architect, George Torricelli, took over the job and quickly found what he was looking for. Alexei Lyovshin, the former gradonachalnik of 1831 to 1837, owned a storehouse that would meet the requirements exactly. He sold it to his fellow citizen Konstantin Paputov. Paputov had many storehouses. On this picture, you can see the biggest one. This was a four-stored storeroom. I couldn't find a picture of the one I'm talking about right now, but I guess this could give an impression how they looked alike. So Paputov bought the place from Lovshin, and then he agreed to rent his newly acquired magazine to the port authorities. After obtaining permission from the Ministry of Interior, General Governor Vorontsov gave green light to the project. So merchants' private commercial interests and the attention given by municipal and ministerial authorities to the enforcement of customs rights were not mutually exclusive in this case. Instead, this example shows how the system of Pagausi was essential to the functioning of a port, while simultaneously benefiting private individuals who in turn were dependent on available, reliable, and secure storage rooms. Like any institution, this system relied on a set of rules which would guarantee mutual obligations. In the case of Paputov's storehouse, swelling discussions to terminate the freeport status in 1849 threatened to end the lucrative source of income for Paputov, since the contract was tied to Odessa's status as Porto Franco, and they were talking about ending the status. In a note to the general governor, Paputov complained to the general governor directly about his unfair treatment. He referred to the fact that the city Duma renewed the rental contract for his warehouse on the 3rd of October 1843, according to Paputov, indefinitely until the end of Porto Franco. However, later this year, Paputov had been informed that the Duma intended to terminate the rent by the 15th of August because the regime of Porto Franco was about to end, and if prolonged for another 5 years under other conditions. Probably because the Duma found the rent too high and looked for different options. So the customs office was about to return the store into Paputov's possession. But Paputov had no intention to take the store back and protested it. Quote, the city Duma has no right to recognize only the former restriction of the law on the term of the Porto Franco of Odessa and not to obey the monarch's last will for a 5-year term of that Porto Franco, for the will of the Tsar is the law. Based on this, the Duma has no power to annul my lawful contract with him, but must pay me for the rent of my store with sellers for customs needs during the existence of the Porto Franco in Odessa. So he tied his argumentation to economic legislation and the projected limitation of the Porto Franco regime from 1849 onwards. He accused the city Duma of opposing the will of the emperor and advocated in favor of complying with the terms of the contract. Vorontsov, the general governor, in turn made inquiries about the state of affairs and received an official statement from the city's administration on the 24th of October. In the eyes of Alexander Krasnachev, Odessa's gradonachalnik, things looked quite different. According to his report, the customs had rented a new storehouse for imported goods with 3 stores from Italian merchant Gerbolini. But then in 1849, the circumstances had changed even again, since there was the hunger for more storeroom even grew. So then the chief of the Odessa customs sent a letter to the governor informing him that the Gerbolini store is so overloaded with goods that it's not possible to receive any more grain from abroad. At the same time, the quarantine board informed the customs that the yards of the quarantine were also packed with imported goods, which could not be transferred to the storehouses. So to make a long story short, storeroom was very scarce. The solution to that problem was as simple as it was tricky. There's nothing more to be done than to resort to hiring additional premises for the customs warehouse, so they looked for more room. And instead of using Paputo's building, customs chief introduced another top-notch merchant to the general governor who was willing to join the game. Baltic German Baron von Mestmacher had approached the Gradonachalnik and requested that his building should be rented for a bit more than 1,000 rubles per year. The rental of this building promised to, according to Customs Chief, eliminate the difficulties encountered by customs and quarantine services in the storage of foreign goods, because it guaranteed the storage space that was so urgently needed. This short example demonstrates that a disadvantage in the port's infrastructure, that is, the lack of storage space, could be transformed into a business opportunity for private merchants. It also points out the limits of the state possibilities to develop the port of Odessa. The state decided to get Odessa into a monopolistic situation, bearing the responsibility to export most of the grain from southern Ukraine. While funds, workforce, and bureaucratic constraints were limited, the boom in grain trade reached exponential heights in the 1840s and overloaded the port yearly. Dealing with this overload meant improvisation and flexible adaptation to changing circumstances. And one of these stories is the one I'm going to tell you now. And this is a story about elevators. So the overload with grain in the port of Odessa doesn't stop with the Crimean War. It doesn't stop in the 1850s and in the 1860s. Odessa always had the problem that there was too much grain coming in and to manage how this grain was processed. So in the 1870s, there was a radical idea. The idea was that one should overcome the storage problem by simply putting the grain directly onto the ships. So that would basically solve the problem. So storehouses weren't that needed anymore. So what I'm going to talk about right now is the case of elevators and the case of an US businessman, showing that this often was not the case, that in the 1870s and 80s, it was impossible to get into like a just-in-time regime for transport of grain. And it additionally demonstrates global entanglements of the Odessa port. All around the globe, debates about the improvement of commercial ports in the 1870s and 1880s centered around technologies for steam-powered mechanical loading and unloading of goods. Engineers and port administrators talked about elevators, pipes, and conveyor belts, all of which promised to make grain loading faster and more efficient and thereby reduce costs and raise profits for the merchants. This steam revolution was not only limited to vessel propulsion, but it was also used to power transportation equipment. One significant role model for this was Chicago and the US Midwest, where the mechanization of grain transport had started comparatively early in the 1860s and 1870s. Russian port planners were struck by the possibilities of elevators and conveyors and urgently pledged to equip the port with these new technologies. US businessmen sensed an opportunity and tried to get into business. In the fall of 1877, during the Russian-Turkish War, St. Petersburg had a remarkable visitor. John A. Gowan visited from Boston. He stayed at the Grand Hotel Europe. His trip had only one purpose. As an agent for his fellow businessmen in New York, he pushed to get the exclusive right for constructing floating grain elevators in Russia's most important ports. This was not Gowan's first trip to Imperial Russia. During the aftermath of the Crimean War, Gowan had already gone to Sevastopol. Back then, the Russian government had commissioned him to raise sunken vessels in the harbors to make them fit for commercial shipping again. While this operation had mixed successes, however, it provided Gowan with profound knowledge of Imperial Russia's ports and economy. 20 years later, he used this knowledge by lobbying for his business friends in Petersburg. On September 14th, Gowan had sent long explanatory notes to the Petersburg Ministry of Finance to make his case. And these notes were supposed to pressure Odessa's port planners by pointing to imminent problems and outlining possible solutions. Well, bear in mind, Gowan had his own agenda in mind, but his analysis of the port's deficiencies shed light on how grain was handled in Odessa. In his report, he immediately pointed to Russia's biggest problem without further ado. So, quote, before introducing elevators in America, Russia had exported over 40 million puts of grain per year. After the elevators in the US had been installed and worked correctly, this amount had fallen to a bit more than 30 million puts every year. And he then continued, since then, export from Russia has decreased every year. Meanwhile, America, which became a strong competitor and rival, reached the point that now it exports abroad 4 times more than Russia. This occurred mainly because Americans made loading the grain cheaper, replacing the hands with machines and the speed at which the loading was completed. Now, why had Russia fallen behind in the 1860s and 70s? To Gowan, the answer was simple. The root of all problems lay in the inefficient ways grain moved from the hinterland to Odessa, to the port and onto the ships. Gowan introduced Odessa as a terrible example, where stores were an enormous obstacle to the movement of grain. So this is a long quote. In Odessa, for example, grain is brought from the hinterland in small wagons, from which workers unloaded in special stores in magazini, and it is constantly necessary to maintain a separate employee for drying and aeration of grain by the most primitive methods, making this operation daily. Then, when the grain is dehydrated, it is taken out of the stores, loaded onto carts, and brought to the gliders, which in turn get it to the bigger ships. Here again, at least 10 workers stand on the sides of the boat and pass the grain in boxes or piles to one another until it finally reaches the hatch of the ship. How much more this would be efficient in the US? Gowan extensively praised the miracles of modern technology that would make manual labor obsolete. And he made sure to set New York as an outstanding example for modern, efficient cargo transport. Relying on elevators, you can see a sketch of an elevator back in that time on the left. There in the US, farmers' wagons are unloaded with the help of elevators into special buildings located at essential points of the railroad. Each of these warehouses has all the necessary mechanical devices for drying, cleaning, and weighing the grain. Then it is unloaded into goods wagons, which deliver the grain to the barges standing on the length of the floating elevator. The latter passes the grain directly from the wagons to the steamships. All this complicated works take place using machines without any manual assistance, beginning with the delivery of grain by farmers and ending with its delivery to foreign markets. Now, Gowan wondered why this technique was implemented in the USA in the 1850s and 1860s, but not in Russia, particularly in its most important port, Odessa. He remembered being approached by a banker from Odessa when he was in Sevastopol about this new way of grain transportation. He made plans to build elevators from Russia back home if the merchants could raise enough funds. This project failed, and Gowan blamed Odessa's foreign merchants for not acting on this. So he came to the conclusion, quote, I became convinced that most grain shippers were Greeks and Jews, who were totally indifferent to the country's industrial progress and trade. Being a non-settled population, they spent their money buying grain, having only temporary and personal interests in mind, quote end. So that is a pretty unfair treatment of Greek and Jewish merchants. But it speaks about the nationalization of trade in the second half of the 19th century and anti-Semitism as a really dominant force in this process. And obviously, Gowan just bought it when he heard about that. 20 years later, in 1877, he tried to get the exclusive rights to buy elevators in all Russian ports, and he made some concessions and tried to get this. But like the first attempt of Gowan, the second one failed. On a short note from November 1877, the ministry informed him that it could not grant Gowan the right to build floating elevators, and the case was closed. Odessa had missed the chance for a decisive turn. 2 years later, the Ministry of Finance hired Robert Obinsky, a Finnish-born economist and professor at the New Russian University of Odessa, as an expert in grain trade, and sent him to the United States to inspect the transportation system and the methods applied there for grading cereals. After returning, he wrote a detailed report in 1880. And this was published as the 450-page volume on the grain trade of the United States and North America. 1 year later, Orbinsky applied his experience to the situation of Odessa and issued a memorandum about the current state of Odessa's grain trade that Patricia Hurley, in her seminal study, brought to attention again. Unsurprisingly, Orbinski recommended installing grain elevators and adopt the American system. And he did not refrain from bringing to attention that already in 1877, the possibility of elevators as a substitute was discussed. But then to get an end to that story, it would cost another 10 years when the first elevators were installed in Odessa in the early 1890s. But what's maybe not so important about that story is about when the elevator was finally placed in Odessa, but about the description of how grain was handled using the storehouses in Odessa in the 1870s. So let me just very briefly tell you about my third case, but I will just go across that very briefly. So that is what is happening in the 1880s and 1890s when the storage space gets off limits from the city and port of Odessa, and a new space is developed. And that space is Peresip in the north of Odessa. Bear in mind that this map, north is on the left of you. And there, new storage space is developed because Odessa was connected to the railroad. And the idea was that if they built a branch to Peresip and a station, that would facilitate bringing grain to the port, even from the 6 kilometer far away Peresip. However, this didn't always work. And as you can see on the right picture, ox-driven carts were more the rule than the exception to transport grain from Peresip to Odessa and to the ships, which was very inefficient in its own way, and made didn't help the cause. But I would love to elaborate more on that in discussion. But I just want to get to a proper conclusion and to some ideas what these stories basically tell us, what we can make of these findings. I think that this all helps read the sources from the 1870s and 1880s a bit better and make sense of the constant complaining of merchants about the decline of Odessa. This is what I've shown you at the very beginning. Because when you look at the actual numbers, and there's a small graph at the end, you can see that the export value of Odessa constantly rises up until 1900. There are only a small dips, and these dips are related to 2 wars and 1 famine. But overall, the volume rises. So the port is prospering its own way. So why do they complain? Why do they complain then? I guess one of the reasons for that is that it's stripping merchants and developers of Odessa from their responsibility, because they have a strategic goal to get into position with the Petersburg administration and to get into favor again, in contrast to their regional competitors. And taken from this perspective, I think this is more of a strategy than an actual description of what is happening. Second and third of all, I think what it helps is that if we trace the paths of Odessa itself, it helps situate Odessa grain trade in regional, imperial, and global contexts. What I mean by that is that we then understand that, for example, there is a reason for these merchants to get into competition with a regional competitor in Nikolaev by approaching the imperial authorities in Petersburg, and also making use, for example, of US businessmen getting ideas into how to make transportation even better. So this would be my exploration of grain trade in Odessa, and I'm now very much looking forward to learn something about fish and fishing in the Russian Empire. And I hand over the floor to Kelly. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. We're going to do the obligatory change over here. All right. In theory, you are now able to see my screen. So from the grain storehouses and elevators of Odessa. I'm going to shift your gaze a little bit further to the east and talk about fish markets and the idea of the catch, lessons from the Black Sea fish market, roughly 1800 to 1900. Everyone loves a good fish story, probably from your next door neighbor to Herman Melville. Fish stories are everywhere. They tend to be very entertaining, and they often have at least a grain of truth in them. So let me start with a fish story, and we'll see what we make of it. The story takes place on the Ural River. You might also think of it, if you're a student of 18th century Russia, as the Yaik River. Just to the east of the Volga, it flows into the Caspian. And there is a story told about this fishery, about a fishery on the Ural River in 1844. So just kind of picture yourself sitting on the bank of the river, watching what proved to be a very entertaining show in 1844. What happened was that the Cossacks of the region had full control over the fisheries on the Ural River, and in return, they had to send mounted regiments whenever the empire requested them. But they did very well otherwise, and the fishery that they controlled extended from the town of Uralsk to the mouth of the river near the Caspian, where it flowed into the Caspian. And there was a ritual that took place each year. And this is what I would like you to try to envision. With winter coming on, with the weather getting colder, the fish of the Caspian would swim from the sea upstream into the river water, into the fresh water. And eventually, as the temperature drops, the river freezes, right? And so on January 1st, by tradition, the Cossack hetman, would order a massive net to be set several feet into the ice. So the ice was very, very thick in this spot. And so men would go out and dig kind of a trench in the ice and set a very deep net across the river. And at this appointed time, roughly 30,000 men would gather on the banks of the river, each equipped with a horse and a sledge. And when the hetman and the local governor gave the signal, and of course the signal was an appropriate cannon fire, right? The men, all 30,000 of these men, would rush out onto the frozen ice to where the fish were, to the bank of fish. And they would take out their long harpoons and begin cutting holes in the ice and harpooning and drawing out the fish that were completely unable to escape from this spot. And some of them would draw out fish weighing up to 200 pounds. And the fish could be big enough that a single man couldn't take the fish out of the hole and would have to enlist the help of a friend or a neighbor, which was great, except that then you had to share the profit from the sale of that fish for everyone who helped pull it out. But there would be this incredible, massive rush onto this thick bed of river ice, and a massive slaughter of fish that took place. The men, after the ceremonial opening to the winter season, the men would stay, often for months, living in tents on the side of the river, harpooning and drawing fish out kind of at their leisure. And merchants would come to the river, to the Cossack fishermen, traveling very great distances on sledges of their own. And their sledges were laden with salt, large amounts of salt and coins, right? And the merchants would pay for the fish on the spot and pile the frozen fish or quantities of caviar that had been taken from them and drive off to Kazan and Moscow, where they would be sold. The winter fishing season generated a massive amount of wealth for the Cossacks. Some of the fishermen would continue fishing into the summer season, but in those months, the fish retreated into the Caspian Sea, and really the high season was the winter. And the fish that were caught in the warmer months would not keep, right? So instead of being sent off in frozen form on journeys hundreds and thousands of kilometers away, fish caught in the warmer months would be salted and sold in nearby towns where they could be consumed without going bad. So this story, I think, is a story that tells of the abundance and the ubiquity of fish, right, in the Russian Empire. And this is something that, if you know a bit about Russian history, you will have heard. This won't be an unfamiliar concept, right? When we think of the Caspian in particular, it is described in many, many different sources as, and I'll quote one of these sources, an enormous fish garden from which one could take more than enough fish to satisfy the demands of the bazaars and markets of all imperial capitals and towns throughout all of great Russian provinces, right? There's this idea that the Caspian alone is so abundant that it can provide for the needs of the empire. And this notion of abundance carries through, right, from the 17th and 18th century into the late 19th century. There's a wonderful set of materials published by the Ministry of State Domains and Ministry of Agriculture in 1893. There's a multi-volume series describing the Russian economy that was meant to support Russia's show at the Columbian World Exhibition in Chicago in 1893. And as part of the preparation for that work, the Inspector of Rural Industry wrote up a description of Russian fisheries, and again extolled this idea of Russian abundance. And he opens with this romantic description of an empire just teeming with fish. There's an example of bream fish caught in Lake Peipus, and there were so many of them that they would throw the bodies back and only eat the tongues, right? And in ancient times. And along the Volga, there were stories of massive bodies of sturgeon who were tossed back into the water once the roe or the glue had been extracted, because there were so many that they didn't need to worry about the main meat of the fish. On the Kuban River, this document tells us only 25 years earlier, so right around the 1860s, the water dipped up in barrels had to be strained through sieves in order to free it from young fish. So the idea is you couldn't even in freshwater areas, right, you couldn't even get a drink of fresh water without taking the fish out of the water. There were so many of them, right? And we also have this idea, this narrative too, that Russians ate a lot of fish, right, in the imperial period. And we know this from domestic and foreign sources. We know it from the Domostroi with its prescriptions for marinated fish and fish soup. And we know it from the writings of foreign visitors who often remarked on the ubiquity of fish at Muscovite markets. Friedrich Christian Weber, a Hanoverian representing English interests at the court of Peter I, reported in 1722 that Russians favored salted and pickled fish, eating it raw right out of the barrels, or using the pickling liquid as a kind of soup sopped up with bread. Visitors were often equally struck by the elevation of fish dishes to the level of the extraordinary. And this is beautifully captured in the work of Dara Goldstein, who has described the kind of succulent contents of the table of Boris Ivanovich Morozov, which was laden in the late 17th century with red and black caviar, dried backbone of sturgeon served with horseradish, steamed herring, bone salted pike, fish steaks, fish sturgeon garnished with cucumbers, and salmon with lemons. It goes on and on and on. While Morozov's table and the table of the elites represents one end of the spectrum of consumption, and certainly helps to capture the idea that fish is abundant and nothing could be more natural, right, than to eat fish and to go fishing for fish. And here's a lovely image of I think an unlikely set of fisher people at work with their hooks and spears trying to pull some fish out of the lake. It certainly remained also a staple of the peasant diet and a staple of the Orthodox diet, which is not to say that nothing changes over time, right? Alison Smith in her work has shown that by the 19th century, some officials actually saw the consumption of fish as a threat to public health. The Journal of the Ministry of Internal Affairs issued repeated warnings about the dire consequences of fish poison, which often came because people ate uncooked salted beluga. They talked about the mortality from imprudence, right, and gluttony. So overindulgence in oysters was seen to be a real problem in the 19th century. So was simple ignorance. And there are stories of bizarre fish-related deaths with fishermen who were silly enough to hold live fish in their teeth only to have the fish then slither down their throats and choke them, right? So there are all kinds of reasons to be thinking and worrying about how to control fish and their consumption. The inescapable fact was that fish was a staple of the Russian diet, and by extension, an essential fuel for the empire. So where did Russians get their fish, right? Well, they caught them or they bought them. And that brings us to the idea of the fish market. At the turn of the 18th century, so right in the 1790s, Sergei Plisheyev published his famous survey of the Russian Empire, and it goes through and identifies all of the regions of the empire where fishing is a prevalent element of the economy. And those areas include everywhere from the northeast with Arkhangelsk and Olenetsk and Vologda, to the Baltics, to Western Siberia, the lower Volga, Novorossiya or New Russia, the Caucasus. In fact, you kind of get the sense that it's difficult to find a place in the Russian Empire where fishing isn't important. But if you really want to get a sense of the fish market in the 18th century, you could crack open the Dictionary of Russian Fairs, published in 1778. And this dictionary, it tells us that at one of the most famous markets in Russia, the market at Murom in Vladimir province, fish was the top selling item, just behind grain and meat, right? Fish, there were some markets that were established purely to facilitate the buying and selling of fish, whether they occurred in January in Vologda province or in the springtime further south. There were annual fairs at Samara and Simbirsk, where fish and caviar that had been drawn from the Ural River was traded. Fish, caviar, fish glue. And if you're interested in fish glue, you should certainly read the work of Matt Romaniello, who has a great piece on isinglass and fish glue. They fetched great prices throughout the year. In Saratov, a town on the Volga River, fishing was a pillar of local industry, providing sustenance for inhabitants as well as producing for trade, right? And this is important. In the 1850s, the officers who were sent to conduct a military survey of the province could barely hold back their astonishment and delight at what they described as the wealth of fish they saw hauled from the river. Herring, beluga, sterlet, catfish, zander, carp. The idea was that tables in local villages and distant towns were just laden with fish caught by men right there in Saratov. So that's the north, and that's the lower Volga. In Ukraine, throughout the Ukrainian provinces, fairs were supplied with red fish or high quality, like the big fish, from the Don River and the Azov Sea. They were also supplied with caviar and glue and fish cord from the mouth of the Volga. And if you're wondering what to do with some of these things, one of the things that's done with some of these stranger products is filter unwanted materials from beer. So there are all kinds of weird uses of these things. The fish that was sold throughout Ukraine, there was a subdivision of fish coming from the Azov and the Don and Astrakhan and Crimean fish, and people tended to know exactly where the fish they were eating came from. There was a small amount of salmon and other things coming from the north, but primarily the fish that was traded and consumed within the Ukrainian provinces came from territories just to the south and southeast, from the Black Sea and from the Azov Sea. The fish market was a traditional briny space in the Russian economy. And even in provinces where it didn't dominate the economic landscape, people were still fishing. Almost without exception, townspeople could rely on the produce of local fishermen to meet their basic needs. But it's important to note that the fish trade was primarily a domestic economy. And there was a huge amount of fish traded within Russian space from the far reaches of the empire. All of that is not to say that everyone everywhere was always fishing, right? That would be an overstatement. And it is also not to say that all fish markets were the same. That is certainly not the case. In the second half of the 19th century, there was a lot of work done to study the output of various fisheries throughout the empire. And there was a sense that the market and the landscape, the geography of Russian fish was changing. So this man, Oskar Andreevich Grimm, who is kind of he's the fish guy. He's the fish guy of the 19th century. You can see his accolades here on the slide. He's a founding member of the Russian Society for Fishing and Fish Farming. He serves on a lake commission for the Russian Geographical Society. He's the inspector of fish, right, in the late imperial period. And he himself authored a chunk of the chapter essentially on fishing that was sent to the World Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. So in his effort to distill a huge amount of complicated information about how many fish were being caught where in the Russian Empire, and he does compile beautiful statistical tables that tell you exactly what species of fish is being caught, how many fish and what their value is. He came up with an idea that he could kind of distill all of this by dividing the European Russia into quadrants, right? And roughly speaking, he said, and he actually gives his statistics this way. He says, let's think of European Russia, and let's apply a really rough grid. And for those of you who want to look carefully at this map, you should know that the map that I very hastily made, the lines are a little bit off, and I can explain a little bit more if you're wondering, but it's meant to be just south of Moscow, and probably a bit of that vertical line should be a bit further to the west, but that was the best I could do. But he said, let's apply this grid, and then let's think about how much of which kind of fish is produced in each part of the grid. And the statistics show that in the late 19th century, fish caught from rivers, freshwater fish, is being produced at essentially the same amount throughout European Russia. That's not the case with lake fish, fish from lakes. That's a story of the northwestern part of Great Lakes of the Lakes region of European Russia. The size of the fish, in case it isn't clear, tells you what percentage is made up by a particular part of the grid. If we look at saltwater fish, we see the dominance of the southeast. We see the dominance of the Caspian and the Black Sea and the Azov. Altogether, if we put together the story of the productivity of fish stock on an annual basis in the 1890s in the Russian Empire, it looks roughly like this. So this is a very rough approximation of where people are catching what kinds of fish at that time. The fish market was certainly changing, and in many quarters of the empire, it was actually becoming, over the course of the 19th century, possible to buy better fish and at lower prices than they ever had before. Sourcing streams and infrastructure were taking new shape. And we can talk about, there are all kinds of complications to this that we can talk about. I'm going to focus our attention to the Black Sea and to the Sea of Azov. So I'm asking you to set aside the higher producing regions of the Caspian and the Lakes region and focus your attention on that southwestern corner of the fish market. The reason for this is that this is where, as we move from the 18th into the 19th century, the Russian Empire is establishing control. Establishing control over this part of the world, over the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, is roughly the story of the mid-18th to the mid-19th century. And this is important because fish had always been crucial to Southern trade. For decades, if not centuries, prior to the annexation of Crimea, which occurs in 1783, the Ottoman Empire's demand for the fish coming out of Crimea or via Crimea was significant, and taxes on fish sales were an important source of income for the Khan. But to Tsarist officials, right, as on the cusp of the 19th century, the fish of the Black Sea were a mystery. And this is important because it gets us to questions of understanding space. Most of us are terrestrial creatures, right? Most of us spend our time on land. So maybe we can be forgiven for forgetting that freshwater landscapes and saltwater landscapes are acquired oftentimes when an empire takes on new pieces of territory, right? There are new hydrographical landscapes that are brought in to the empire. And when we usually talk about Russia's southward expansion, we talk about the land and we talk about the people, but we don't often talk about the water. We ought to, though, because the people we study, the people who inhabited the Russian Empire in the 19th century, certainly talked about the water. If you don't grow up on a particular stretch of a river or beach, you don't know its secrets, right? You don't know treacherous spots from the shallows. You don't know the tides or the fishing holes. And coming to know those watery spaces takes a great deal of time and energy and knowledge, and often technology. So Russians needed, or Russian imperial officials needed and wanted to learn about the currents, about seasonal variation. They wanted to learn the contours of the shorelines and the riverbeds and the seafloors. And then there's the whole question of the things that swim, right? The things that crawl. the things that crash and grind and grow. How many were there? Where were they? Were they tasty? Was there a market for any of it? I love this map. I think it's quite a beautiful map. It was produced by one of the best cartographers of the 19th century, Fyodor Fyodorovich Schubert, who is a very famous military cartographer, military topographer. And this is his map of the Northern Black Sea region, originally produced in the 1830s. This is a later edition with some color added. And I love it because, unless I'm mistaken, it tells you two things about this region. It tells you that this region, the land, is filled with things, right? With settlements and roads and rivers, all kinds of things. That space is so busy. And it also tells you that the water is completely empty, right? The water just sits there like an empty canvas with nothing happening on it. And this is a very familiar view of the Black Sea, right, to most of us. This makes sense to us. And just so that you can orient yourself in space, just in case it's not obvious, here's Odessa, right here over on the northwestern coast. There's the city of Odessa. And over here is Mariupol, which also is one of those places we used to have to explain to most people, where is Mariupol? And, now, unfortunately, people do tend to know where Mariupol is. It has been razed to the ground by the Russian army in the last 2 months. There it is. You can see it existing. In the 1830s, it was established for that. And interestingly enough, if you know anything about Crimea, you will know that Mariupol was founded by Greeks who moved out of Crimea to the mainland in the 1770s. And they renamed many of the places around Mariupol after places in Crimea. So you will see, if you look carefully there, Yalta, Mangush, Stary Krim, Sartana, these are all places that exist in Crimea. And it's like a mini Crimea that exists on the Sea of Azov. So anyway, here's this familiar view, right, of this Black Sea space, but it's not the only way to see this space. In the 19th century, naturalists and botanists and explorers, men of science, and often their wives with them, were traveling through and documenting nature in new and exciting and important ways. And one of the people who set about this work was named Karl Goblitz, who is a botanist and a member of the Imperial Academy of Sciences. He went through and exhaustively studied all of these new fish, these unfamiliar fish in the waters of Tavrida province. And he produced, should you ever need some fun summer reading, an exhaustive list of all these fish with descriptions of them. He tells you all about the trout, which come out of the mountain streams. And he tells you about the red mullet, which is considered one of the most delicious fish in the entire Black Sea. He tells you about the Pandora fish, which is found only near Sevastopol. And it's a beautiful, delicate fish with a markedly delicious taste, he tells us. He tells us about the common cockle, which is common throughout the Black Sea, especially in the East, and is common. It's a common food source, but also used to decorate grottos, right? So he goes through and he documents all of this, but cartographers are also at work at the same time that people are kind of generating these catalogs of what exists here, what can be fished, what their characteristics are. Cartographers are training their sites on the water itself and paying a little bit less attention to the land. And so here's a lovely English language map of the Black Sea from 1801, where that distinction between land and sea is a bit more in balance. And you can see there's a bit of attention paid more to the coastlines and to the soundings around the coastline. If we zoom in just a little bit, you can get a sense of there's New Odessa right over on one side of your screen and Mariupol is on the other. The notes on the map begin to give you a sense that people are starting to pay more attention to water and to what it contains, to the fish and the caviar, to the fact that the Dnieper freezes, right? To the fact that there's very little tidal shift in the Sea of Azov, right? Information about the maritime kind of resources of the empire are showing up in maps. I'm going to zoom in on this area that I've just put a box around just to knowing what you're looking at. This is a map also from the 1780s, actually. It's a beautiful map of the mouth of the Dnieper. And it has all kinds of interesting information about the water, right? We have the shift to an interest there. And one of the things that you begin to notice about maps of the Black Sea is that mentions of fishing and fisheries are always there. So here you see the fisheries, little fishing huts of the Cossacks, right? This is a map from a couple of decades later, from 1856. that shows that exact same spot. It is a military map, and it is meant to tell you something a little bit misleading about the history of the Crimean War. There's a wonderful amount of detail here. Now you see telegraph locations and all kinds of ships. You can see steamships in addition to sailboats. And you see the destruction of a Chakov right here. It's very dramatic and very narrative. But even this cartographer who's interested in telling the story of the war doesn't forget to point out the fisheries right at the mouth of the Dnieper. Again, there's this sense that these are important and quantifiable things that need to be known and controlled. This, I know it's a little bit hard to see. I will zoom in a little bit and hopefully make it a bit easier for you to see what is going on this beautiful map produced from, and I defaulted to English language maps in an effort to try to make them easier to read for most people. This is a map of the Sea of Azov. And it's produced in London by one of the most famous English cartographers of the 18th century. It's produced in 1856, and it really occurs at a watershed moment in the study and management and measurement and quantification and analysis of the fish trade. Now, that moment isn't really tied to this map. It's just that this map is made at the exact same time that the Ministry of State Domains decides to collaborate with the Russian Geographical Society to conduct a series of very detailed studies of the fishing industry. Their main interest is to try to organize the fishing of sturgeon in the Volga and Caspian Basin. But they treat all of the fishing areas of the empire. So it is the work, I guess I'll show you a couple of details from this map. There are a lot of notes here on this map that tell you about the water, the brackish water, where the fresh water from the Don flows down into the Azov, the fact that the current is negligible in the Sea of Azov. We begin to really think about how you can get around and what might be moving around this space. If we zoom in on the straits of Kerch-Calais in the south, we'll see that although we don't ever see fish on maps, we see mentions of fish on maps. Great number of fish on the coast. They're here, they're everywhere. And all of those little notations there are a couple of windmills mushed in with them, but they're fishing huts, right? These are fisheries, fishing installations on the edges of spits of land in the Sea of Azov. It is kind of embedded in these stories of how people are talking about the Sea of Azov. And these are the two guys, Danilevsky and Baer, who are in charge of this exhaustive collaborative study of the fish and fish trade of the empire. And they produce, I believe it's 8 volumes that they published between 1860 and 1876 that describe fishing across European Russia. They're exhaustive and detailed, and their approach is regional. It's not based on provinces or administrative units. It's based on seas and rivers. And the organizational unit of their work is the fishery. So for them, every fishery is kind of a microcosm of the imperial landscape. So they actually see the Sea of Azov in their kind of long volume, the exact same way that Stanford sees the Sea of Azov in his map produced at pretty much the same time. They see a landscape of teeny, tiny fisheries, each of which they describe in detail. The number of boats that are coming out of each of these spits, whether or not you can stand there at all moments of the tide on these spits, how deep the water is, whether or not people are using hooks or nets. There's an incredible amount of detail of the kind of fish that's being caught, the technology that's being used to catch the fish, and then the mechanisms through which the catch is distributed across the space of the empire. And as you make your way through this volume, you begin to see that there are incredible ways in which geography and temporality, seasonality shape the fish trade. So it makes sense in terms of transportation, right? The kind of horses or oxen, whether you're using a sledge or a carriage or a cart to move across terrestrial space. But it's also true that seasonality impacts the way fish move through spaces, right? So they move differently in the winter and differently in the summer. If you remember back to that story about the Cossacks on the Ural River, we learn really interesting things about ways that very small parts of the empire, places that you might not have heard of before, are integrated into broader spaces, regions, such as the region of the Black Sea or the Southern Empire. Berdyansk, for example, which is a small town, was founded as the result of the pursuit of fishing interests by a very small number of fishermen who came to work there, and in 1833 secured permission to build a lighthouse and then to develop a series of fishing ventures right on the coast. Factories were built, and they were fueled by the work of 300 men, and they fished. They fished the river and the sea, and they salted their catch, and they prepared caviar, and they prepared fish grease and glue and balik, and they sold these products for as much as 7 to 11 silver rubles per pud, which was an awful lot of money at the time. And they sold it in Kherson, over, on the other side of the Black Sea. In winter, the catch was sold fresh, and in summer, it was dried and salted, bundled and barreled, and sent with haste all throughout Little Russia. It's described as Little Russia and the Western provinces. The proximity of the Crimean salt lakes was a boon to the fisheries of this whole region. Mariupol is on here. There are some interesting stories about kind of battles for control over fishery there. We can kind of talk about those if you want a little bit later. But let me just tell you one other thing about what becomes known about this particular region. It's described by Baer and Danilevsky as a place that is incredibly rich in fish stock, with winter fish and summer fish. It is renowned for its shallow water. Shallow water makes it nearly impossible for large boats to sail, but it makes it really easy to fish. Fishermen have no need to travel far from home. They don't have to pack provisions. These Azov fish are fattier than their Caspian counterparts, which means that their price per weight is higher. The water has a low salinity. The shoreline has lots and lots of spits that are great for fishing. And the Azov has major settlements along it, such as Rostov, Taganrog, Berdyansk, Mariupol, and those places maintain regular maritime traffic with Odessa. That is one of the keys to the success of the Azov fisheries, that they have maritime connections with Odessa and overland connections with Kharkov, overland in Ukraine. So they have both water-based and land-based connections with part of the Southern Empire. We see similar things going on at the mouth of the Dnieper, where I showed you that kind of beautiful mouth shown by with the kind of military activity. There too, right at Kinborn, at the end of the spit, there are those ample fisheries that I was telling you about. They catch mackerel, a version of mackerel there, and they would place them in careful layers in casks, and the casks came from the local region, and they would keep layers of salt in between each layer of fish. And the salt, of course, came somewhat from Crimea, but other places too, and it would be floated down rivers in huge carved out oak trees. And they would take out the salt and salt the fish and put the fish in the casks. And those casks would cost 1 ruble and 30 kopecks, and they would hold between 3,000 and 5,000 fish. And they would make an incredible amount of profit from the annual catch of the salted casked fish that was being exported throughout the Western provinces, but primarily was being bought by Jewish merchants who came from Poland, made their purchases at Kinburn, and then sailed the salted fish to Ochakov and then overland beyond. What you begin to get out of all of this, and I'll kind of draw my conclusion here, is that when you begin to look at the kind of nuances of the fish trade, whether you look truly at the Azov or the Black Sea or anywhere else in the empire, you begin to see that geography is overlaid with seasonality, right? Distances and supplies conspire in all kinds of interesting ways. The market is concentrated formally in the hands of a very few wholesalers and merchants, but there's a huge informal kind of local traffic. And the cart drivers who have cartloads of salted fish who are distributing it across the Don region or selling the red fish that they catch on their own are part of a network that has both local and regional and also imperial reach. So the fish catch, part of it will stay where it's caught, and part will be sold off in Kharkov and Kursk. Some makes its way to Moscow and St. Petersburg. None of it is irrational or illogical. It has a logic and an intentionality of its own. And looking at all of this tells us a couple of interesting things about the empire. And I'll sum it up, I guess, by saying this. And we can talk about the role that like tinning technology plays in caviar if you want to. I think I know a little bit too much about these kinds of things at this point, but all of this movement of fish, the production and the consumption of fish, tells us this. If you remember back to the story of the Cossacks and that story of abundance and ubiquity, that is part of the story, but it's not all of it. There's a lot more here to learn about the specificity of place and of practice, but also if we truly want to understand how the empire functioned, what its shape really was, we need to stop thinking about time the way we think about it, right? We don't want to think about reigns of czars. We don't even need to think about things happening on an annual basis all the time. Perhaps we should think about seasonal change. Perhaps we should think about tides and currents and how they change trade relations. When we think about technology in the 19th century in this region, we need to think about rail lines, but there are a lot of other forms of technology that are influencing the distribution of goods through the empire. And looking at the fish trade, we see them. The application of fish hooks and ice boxes and tin cans, all kinds of things that we might not consider that play a crucial role in shaping the economy of the empire. And finally, if we want to think geographically about the empire, perhaps we need to stop thinking about administrative boundaries and imperial borders all the time. Those things are important. But we might want to start integrating water. And when we do, we begin to see that when we talk about imperial space, we need to think about more than these border changes and administrative regions. We want to think about an empire that possibly should be seen as an empire changed by season, an empire that could shift with the tide. And when we do, we might see everyone's experience a bit differently. Thank you. So the floor is open for questions. As you think, if you have any, we certainly welcome them. There's so many fun things to talk about. And as you kind of ruminate over what questions you might want to ask, I thought I might invite my colleague to share. We thought a little bit about kind of what we might learn from each other about the concept of the Black Sea and the concept of the region. So Boris, I wonder if you might share a thought with us about kind of how you see this space.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me thank you for your talk, which really connected to many things I'm thinking of right now. And when it comes to the sea, I immediately discovered that there is not only fish drawn in the sea, but also ships, right? So I guess this is something which is kind of obvious, that most of these maps tend to focus on land-based transport. And so this is something which is definitely not something which works for Odessa very good, since Odessa is very much about sea transport. And so I'm wondering where my story fits into that. And I guess there is an overall framework about the Black Sea in the 9th century, and this framework is globalization. So you question the imperial paradigm, but I would also question the globalization paradigm in the way that globalization stories tend to narrate, connections and entanglements a bit too much, maybe. And so I think one of the divergent perspectives one gets is when we don't look at the ships. So then we have stories of movement. But when we look at the ports, we see about the challenges that faced infrastructures when globalization kicked in. So they were designed to get ships and goods moving, but this was often not the case. And I guess this tells a bit a different story when we look at the micro level. And I appreciate it that you've done that as well. That it's maybe not only wars, economic policies, and diplomatic tensions that hindered goods from being moved, right? So it's not about the Crimean War so much, and not about liberalism versus protectionism and so on. But it's also logistical and organizational stuff that matters. So the everyday of moving goods around, and this of course, there were these utopian goals of overcoming these problems by modern technology, but as I've shown, this didn't work to a large extent. So I guess this is one thing where this approach might fit in, that if we see the difficulties, the obstacles, and the challenges of moving things when we look at a port. And this helps us better to understand, well, about how these entanglements that we observe were structured, basically. And I guess this is what's interesting to me. And this is something, I guess, where if we look at the ports in the northern Black Sea shore, there are many commonalities among these ports, because basically they were challenged with the same problems. And what I also wanted to say is I really like your point about diminishing the role of time, because when you look at that organizational point of view, this is something I was really struck by watching, that the overload of grain in the port of Odessa seems to be a constant problem across the whole 19th century. And so there we have something happening, grain coming into Odessa, despite what's happening in Petersburg or so. And this is something which is kind of a story of a longue durée, and which also questions these common caesuras we are used to when describing Black Sea history. So this would be my ideas about that, but I'm wondering about how your ideas about that would be.
No, it's so interesting. I really loved listening to way you mentioned at one point, kind of the changing and relative importance of Nikolaev and Odessa, right? And the very different stories that are told about those two cities over the 19th and 20th centuries. And I thought that, to me, that's a point that really stuck out to me as well, because absolute importance tends to be the thing that we key into, and relative importance is a little bit more difficult to kind of hold on to. And thinking about how the fates of, grain that comes to a standstill in Odessa, right, where there's just so much of it, and they can't distribute it out, right? But then that grain is standing still while grain shipments are coming in, paired with shipments of other goods, right, coming from all over the place by ship, by tiny little boat, right, by cart, and by all kinds of methods. There's so much in motion, and so much staying still at the same time. And in a way, that's not a problem that's unique to our topics. But I think it's a really salient challenge in how you narrate this, right? How you talk about this as a historian. How do you keep certain things moving and certain things staying still, and keep your reader interested and enthusiastic about the importance of staying still? Right? It's a really interesting narrative challenge. And the other thing that I think of when I'm thinking about the Black Sea and kind of listening to your work has kind of reinforced to me is the challenge of thinking about where it begins and ends, and what really are we talking about? We say the words Black Sea, but as I said at the beginning of my talk, most of the time, most people don't actually mean the sea. They mean the lands that are connected to it, right? And I think there's a huge opportunity lost there, right? I think we need to think more carefully about the sea itself and how it shapes the fates of those ships, right, that are sailing in and out of ports. And that's another narrative challenge, right? I mean, it's easy to say, oh, well, this grain shipment was lost because there was a storm at sea and the ship sank, right? And the goods were lost. And the agency of the water is kind of narratable. But oftentimes it's not. And it becomes more difficult. And that's why I turn to fish, because, they're moving through the water, but they're easier to narrate. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a whole array of really interesting kind of analytical and challenges, both how we think about the empire, but also how we talk about these spaces as historians, that are really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
I think we have a question from Anne Babrov Hajal. And she says, that she loves the idea that time should be seen differently by historians. And her question is for you, Boris. I very much enjoyed your descriptions of the various fascinating elements of warehouses in Odessa. And I understand your final point that Odessa merchants may have had a vested interest in describing the port of Odessa to St. Petersburg as falling behind American ports. What I didn't fully understand was what the Odessa merchants wanted. Did they want more government investment in mechanizing floating loading systems, or were they more focused on wanting more emphasis on merchants' interests in making profits from warehouses? So yeah, what did they want?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a great question. And I mean that in the literal sense of the word, because this is really what I'm thinking of. So I'm trying to make sense of these approaches towards the Petersburg ministries, and I'm trying to decipher the strategy they have. But I'm really not sure. So what I was trying to do is to get into the mindset of these merchants, right? So what they were thinking of. And I discovered that when I looked upon, so one problem of the Port of Odessa was that manual labor was very costly after 1900. So this is due to worker strikes. So they raised the loans for workers. And then manual labor started to get more expensive and to outweigh mechanical ways of transport, given the costs, because this was one of the problems that in the 70s and 80s, manual labor was much cheaper than investing in any kind of mechanical transportation. And so what I have to admit is that by reading these sources, I tended to, become a bit of a Marxist by myself, because the only thing that mattered to them, at least in their official statements, were the costs of moving a put in kopecks, right? So this is only about how much does it cost. So there is no engagement with the social situation of workers, and so on and so on. And so I estimate, without being unfair, I guess, that the promise for them in mechanical transportation was that it ultimately would lower the costs of transportation and also avoid I haven't said that, right? And I just want to mention that the problem with grain not being transported is, right, when it's stored and it's not properly stored, and that's what mainly happens. And there's a humidity, then it rots, and it is lost by then. And so this is also a risk you want to avoid. And because of that is the promise to moving grain faster. So you can avoid the risk of rotting for your grain, and you can ship it and sell it, and then you have more profit. So I guess this is basically a motivation that we observe here.
Yeah, and I love that, that caution that the application of novel technology doesn't necessarily guarantee higher profits or more efficient outcomes, right? Technologies come with they're fraught with their own kind of challenges. I'm just reminded that fishermen started complaining in the second half of the 19th century that steam engines that were facilitating the movement of ships and goods across the Black Sea were scaring the fish away, right?
So I'm going to read out the next questions to us both, I guess. And this is a question about our try to decolonize Russian imperial history right now. So much of what we are talking about is today's Ukraine, and and the question is about what we think about this micro approach and focus on the Black Sea as a good way to do this work of decolonizing, seeing things from other perspectives, not from the center or its representatives in the provinces. I guess this is the question.
So this question comes from Eileen Kane. Thank you, Eileen. It is a really good one, and I guess the easy answer is to say, I do think that this is a path forward, or a path or an alternate path, right? To struggling to find some kind of alternate, better, but just alternate vocabulary or kind of categories of analysis for thinking about these places. And, it's relatively easy to say, let's throw out the categories we're already so familiar with. It's much more difficult to replace them with something meaningful, right, and useful. And I feel like that is the challenge. But there is something, thinking about Ukraine and its history right now, obviously has been a very emotional experience for all of us over the last few months. And I will say that it is that working on this project has relieved some of the anxiety that I might have otherwise been feeling about my work, because it does decenter the narrative. And this happens to be a project where there are sources that allow you, a variety of different sources that allow you to think pretty carefully about a variety of different perspectives. And so I think, I'm not sure if I could tell you that I have found a path forward, right? I mean, no. But I do think there's an opening here to thinking a little bit more, I don't know, in an exploratory fashion about what we mean when we say region, what we mean when we say top down or bottom up, and who should be involved in the cast of characters, right? As Boris had. So to me, it's been a good thing to be working on at this particular moment in time. Not uncomplicated, but I'm interested. I'm hooked, if you will pardon the pun. Boris, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think my answer to Eileen's question is twofold. So one thing I think is that it's really valuable to stay with the perspective from the center, in the way that this is also something about colonization and decolonization. The problem for Odessa was that it was forced by Petersburg to be the main export port for grain trade. And this hindered several developments from taking place. For example, the building of an industry that would, diversify the economy of Odessa. And so I think, as I learned from John Randolph, being part of an empire means privileges and obligations. And I guess what we see here is basically, at least in economic term, an obligation of empire. That means there is a specific role of Odessa given by Odessa from the center in Petersburg. And this had tremendous costs, because this also contributed to the crisis then unfolding in the 1900s. So this is one part where I would say maybe the framework of colonial history applies here, at least in economic terms, to say that there is some kind of colonization of this export port. And the second thing would be that, as my example, I think, shows that the people living in there and knowing about what is needed and what to do and how to frame their narratives around what's happening in Odessa, they also have influence towards the center. So this is also a story about local agency and about these people not only being the victims of what is decided for them, but about doing something about it. And this is, I guess, this is where the local perspective is very, very important to have. And then there is, of course, the other, the adjacent question about, they are so powerful because they are connected not only to the empire center, but to other global port cities and to other cities on the southern border of the Black Sea. And this is a resource they really, exploit when bringing their argument forward. So I guess this is really, really important.
And I suppose I would just, one other kind of point is that I suppose there's only, at least in my case, you're only able to push things so far away from the center. It's always interesting to think about the levels through which, and the kind of the filters through which any information about the past has been passed, right? So much of the information that we have now about local practices, fishing practices, local disputes between members of, Greek colonist communities and Cossacks in the Sea of Azov, or, a lot of that information is being processed by imperial officials or by agents of the Russian Geographical Society, and recorded and massaged and packaged into these, these narratives that often pose as really objective descriptions of economic space. And again, it's not something that's necessarily unique to the particular topics that we're dealing with, but when you are trying to think carefully about space, right? I think, as both of us are doing, I think you're constantly asking yourself questions about information and questions about perspective and questions about ambiguity and the things that you're not knowing it seems kind of inherent in the work of doing a project that has a spatial component to it. So we are out of time. It is 1:30, and I think this is the moment where I should extend a heartfelt thanks to all of you who decided to spend an hour and a half with us, and a special thanks to Boris for being here. I mean, it's such an indulgence to be able to spend some time, actually in the same place as a fellow historian who shares so many some interests and is doing such interesting work. So I look forward to the book. Hurry up and write it. And a final thanks to the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies for hosting the event, for all the support that they give us on an ongoing basis. So thank you all. Enjoy your wonderful Wednesday in May, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.